Good morning, dear students. This is fifth part of Mother's Day. And students, today we will cover approximately 3/4 of this lesson. So students, without getting delay, let's get started with the lesson. Right. So as you can see on the top, Doris, August, go off for the weekend. Mrs. Pearson, why not? I could do with a change. Stuck here day after day, week after week. If I don't need a change, who does? Doris, but where would you go? Who would you go with? Mrs. Pearson, that's my business. You don't ask me where you should go and who you should go with, do you? Doris, that's different. Mrs. Pearson, the only difference is that I am a lot older and better able to look after myself. So, it's you who should do the asking. Doris, did you fall or hit yourself with something? Mrs. Pearson coldly, no, but I will hit you both. I will hit you with something. Girl, if you don't stop asking silly questions. Doris stares at her open mouth, ready to cry. Doris, oh, this is awful. She begins to cry, not passionately. Mrs. Pearson coldly, stop blubbering. You are not a baby. If you are old enough to go out with Charlie Spence, you are old enough to behave properly. Now stop it. George Pearson enters left. He is about 50, fundamentally decent but Solomon. Self-important, pompous, preferably he should be a heavy, slow moving type. He notices Doris' tears. George, hello, what's this? Can't be anything to cry about? Doris, through sobs, you will see. Doris runs out left with a sob or two on the way. George stares after her moment, then looks at Mrs. Pearson. George, did she say you will see? Mrs. Pearson, yes. George, what did she mean? Mrs. Pearson, better ask her. George looks slowly again at the door, then at Mrs. Pearson. Then he notices the stout that Mrs. Pearson raises for another sip. His eyes almost bulge. Right? So here aghast means filled with horror or shock. So more shocked she couldn't believe when Mrs. Pearson said that she might go on a vacation this weekend. Mrs. Pearson replied that she out of all deserves to take a break as she works day and night continuously. So Doris is confused. Doris is confused as to where she would go and with whom. Mrs. Pearson expresses that Doris has no business asking her all this because she never asked Doris the same stuff. Doris tells her that's a different thing. And Mrs. Pearson clarifies that she is older than Doris and it is better position to take care of herself. So it would make sense if Doris would take permission from Mrs. Pearson and not the other way round. So what Doris says? Doris says, finally ask Mrs. Pearson if she hit and got concussions or something. Mrs. Pearson replied in negative and she said she might hit her with something for sure. So almost about to cry, Doris expresses how disheartening it is to go through all this, and while she says, she burst into tears. Mrs. Pearson asked Doris to stop crying, right? Because she considers herself mature enough to go out with Charlie Spence, then she could act properly at home as well. And George Pearson enters from the left side at the same, and he notices the tears of Doris, and as they are talking, George Pearson, Mrs. Pearson's husband, enters. He is a man in his 50s who is characterized by deep sincerity, but it's self-assertive. Right? So he asked her what's the matter, and sure for the matter won't be worthy of crying. So Doris tells her father to wait and observe while she is crying and runs out of the seat. George Pearson is left amazed and how she ran and what she said. Mrs. Pearson replied to George's rhetorical question. He is still confused about what's going on, right? And Mrs. Pearson raises her glasses to sip her stout. George gets even more shocked. So what Mrs. Pearson said, George, stout? Mrs. Pearson said, yes. George, amazed, what are you drinking stout for? Mrs. Pearson, because I fancied some. George, at this time of day? Mrs. Pearson, yes. What's wrong with it at this time of day? George, bewildered, nothing. I suppose any, but I have never seen you do it before. Mrs. Pearson, well, you are seeing me now. George, with heavy distaste. Yes, and I don't like it. It does not look right. I am surprised at you. Mrs. Pearson, well, that ought to be nice change for you. George, what do you mean? Mrs. Pearson, it must be some time since you were surprised at me, George. George, I don't like surprises. I am all of for my study going on. You ought to know that by this time, by the way. I forgot to tell you this morning I wouldn't want any tea. Special snooker match night at the club tonight and a bit of super going. So no tea. Mrs. Pearson, that's all right. Doesn't any. George, astonished, you mean you didn't get any ready? Mrs. Pearson, yes, and a good thing too, as it's turned out. George, aggrieved. That's all very well, but suppose I would wanted some. Mrs. Pearson, my goodness, listen to the man. Annoyed because I don't get a tea for him. That's don't even want. Ever tried that at the club? George, tried what at the club? Mrs. Pearson, going up to the bar and telling them you don't want a glass of beer, but you are annoyed because they haven't already poured it out. Try that on them and see what you get. George, I don't know what you are talking about. Mrs. Pearson, they would laugh at you even more than they do now. Right. So Mrs. Pearson advises him to ask Doris what she meant. So Mrs. Pearson raises her glass to sip her stout. George was even more shocked. Mrs. Pearson lets him know that he saw right. Still amazed, George asks the reason behind her drinking. So still maintaining her calm, she simply replies by saying that she is drinking because she wanted to. He is shocked at the sight of Mrs. Pearson drinking. She counter questions and asks what is the problem with drinking at this time of the day. So, right, you will have to write the meaning of bewildered. Right, you will have to write the meaning of bewildered here. Right, I will have to explain the hard words here. So, bewildered means perplexed or confused, even you can say. So, he explains that he is shocked because Mrs. Pearson had never been seen day drinking. She tells him that there is nothing to be shocked about. If he hadn't seen her do it till date, he is seeing her do it now. So, in contempt, he tells Mrs. Pearson that he didn't like the idea of drinking at this hour. It blew his mind at once. So, responding to his reactions, she says that it could be a nice change for him. He didn't understand. So, she explains that it's been a long time since she amazed him. Snooker means it is a game, right? So, he tells her how he doesn't appreciate change and or surprise, and this is something Mrs. Pearson should know by now. He then changes the topic by telling Mrs. Pearson that he forgot to tell her about the special snooker and the supper. Also, he won't be needing any tea that afternoon. So, she tells that she had not made anything. Shocked at her reply, Mrs. Pearson, she just told him. Mrs. Pearson replies that it has turned out to be well because he didn't need any tea. George, he asked Mrs. Pearson if he wanted some. So, Mrs. Pearson expresses her ignorance at the fact that George Pearson is angry that the tea he didn't want is not made. She suggested that he should try this behavior at the club sometime. Right? So, Mrs. Pearson, he is not sure at what Mrs. Pearson is telling him to try at the club. She explained that tea is the situation in context of the club where he goes to the bar to tell them that he doesn't want a beer, and then he gets mad at them because they hadn't already poured some of him. She suggested that he tries and see the reaction. Right? So he pretends to not have understood what Mrs. Pearson just said. So Mrs. Pearson says that people at club would make fun of him even more than they did. Right? Now, George indignantly laugh at me. They don't laugh at me. Mrs. Pearson, of course they do. You ought to have found that out by this time. Anybody else would have done. You are one of their standing jokes. Famous, they call you Pompey Pearson because they think you are so slow and pompous. George, horrified, never. Mrs. Pearson, it's always beaten me why you should want to spend so much time at the place where they are always laughing at you, behind your back and calling your names, leaving your wife at home night after night instead of going out with her. Who doesn't make you look a fool? Cyril enters right with a glass of milk in one hand and a thick slice of cake in other. George, almost dazed, turns to him appealingly. George, hey Cyril, you have been with me to club once or twice. They don't laugh at me and call me Pompey Pearson, do they? Cyril, embarrassed, hesitates angrily. Go on, tell me, do they? Cyril, embarrassed. Well, yes, Dad, I'm afraid they do. George slowly looks from one to other, staggered. George, slowly. Well, I will be damned. George exits left, slowly, almost if somebody had hit him over the head. Cyril had, after watching him go, turns indignantly to Mrs. Pearson. Now, you should not have told him that, Mum. That's not a fair. You have hurt these feelings mine too. Mrs. Pearson, sometimes it does people good to have their feelings hurt. The truth ought not to hurt anybody for long. If your father did not go to the club so often, perhaps they would stop laughing at him. Cyril, gloomily, I doubt it. Right? So here he gets irritated with Mrs. Pearson. जब Mrs. Pearson ने ये कहा कि yes, they laugh at you. So he gets irritated when Mrs. Pearson says that and tells her that they don't make fun on him. Mrs. Pearson, pompous means self-important. Right? Pompous means P-O-M-P-O-U-S. Pompous means self-important. So Mrs. Pearson tells him that he should have known this by now. If there would have been someone else in his place, they would have known by now. She also tells him that he is famously made fun about the club and they call him Pompey Pearson because they think he is a self-absorbed and overbearing. So George is horrified, right? And Mrs. Pearson expresses how hurtful it had been for seeing her husband leaving her and wanting to go to place where people make fun of him behind his back. She further adds that he does every night instead of going out with Mrs. Pearson, who does not at least make him look like a fool. So Cyril enters the room holding a glass of milk and a big piece of cake. George, confused, and turns to look Cyril and ask and seek his help. He asked Cyril angrily if he knew this had been going on the club, leaving Cyril embarrassed and unwilling. So, the meaning of staggered you will have to write S-T-A-G-G-E-R-E-D. Staggered means astonished or deeply shocked. Right. So, thou uneasily he told George that they indeed call his names. George crushes himself slowly that if they call him names at the club, then he may go to hell. He leaves the scene as if he has been hit on the head. Cyril sees him go and turns to talk to Mrs. Pearson. Cyril puts forward his point of view and says if it was not nice of Mrs. Pearson to have done that to his father. She not only hurt his feelings but also Cyril's. She then imparts some words of wisdom by telling him that truth only hurts for a short while, and if it's fine to get on one's feeling hurt at a time. She further mentions that this would not have happened if his father didn't go to the club every other day. He doesn't believe in whatever Mrs. Pearson has to say at the moment. And now, Mrs. Pearson, severely, possibly you do, by what I doubted is whether your opinion is worth having. What do you know? Nothing. You spend too much time and good money at greyhound races and dirt tracks and ice shows. Cyril, sulkily, well, what if I do? I have got to enjoy myself somehow, haven't I? Mrs. Pearson, I won't mind so much if you were really enjoying yourself, but are you? And where is getting you? There's a sharp hurried knocking here of left. Cyril, might be for me, I will see. Cyril hurries out of left. In a moment he re-enters, closing the door behind him. It's that silly old bag from next door. Mrs. Fitzgerald, you don't want her here, do you? Mrs. Pearson sharply, certainly I do. Ask her in, and don't call her a silly old bag either. She is a very nice woman with a lot more senses than you will ever have. Cyril exits left. Mrs. Pearson finishes her stout, smacking her lips. Cyril re-enters left, ushering in Mrs. Fitzgerald, who hesitates in the doorway. Come in, Mrs. Fitzgerald. Mrs. Fitzgerald, moving to left center anxiously, I just wondered if everything's all right. Cyril sulkily, no, it's not. Mrs. Pearson sharply, of course it is. You be quiet. Cyril indignantly and loudly, why should I be quiet? Mrs. Pearson shouting, because I tell you to, you silly spoilt young peasant. Mrs. Fitzgerald protesting nervously, oh no, surely. Mrs. Pearson severely, now, Mrs. Fitzgerald, just let me manage my family in my own way, please. Mrs. Fitzgerald, yes, but Cyril. Cyril sulkily and glowering, Mr. Cyril Pearson, to you. Please, Mrs. Fitzgerald. Cyril stacks off into the kitchen. Now अब यहाँ पे देखिए कि अब थोड़ी सी कहानी यहाँ पर टर्न ले रही है. He doesn't believe in whatever Mrs. Pearson has to say at the moment. Mrs. Pearson makes it clear that she did not invite Cyril's opinion on the matter. She mentions that he also doesn't have enough knowledge to talk about these things because all he knows is spending time and money on greyhound races and ice shows. Sulkily means S-U-L-K-I-L-Y. Sulkily means showing a disagreeable mood. Right. So, here Cyril mentions that he doesn't find any problem in doing so if it brings him joy. Mrs. Pearson lets him know that she has no problem with him doing all those things if they really bringing him joy. She asks Cyril if he is actually getting the enjoyment he claims to have achieved in the addition. It is taking him nowhere good. Suddenly, someone knocks on the door. Thinking that someone must have visited him, Cyril goes back to check the door and comes back after a while and tell Mrs. Pearson that it was Mrs. Fitzgerald. He doesn't regard her very respectfully and asks Mrs. Pearson if she really wants to see her. So, Mrs. Ushering means showing or guide someone, right? So, very clearly she replies that indeed she wants to see Mrs. Fitzgerald and also tell him to treat her with the respect, right? Because she was a nice woman. While Cyril guides Mrs. Fitzgerald to Mrs. Pearson finishes her stout and greets her when she finally sees her. Hesitating, she enters and asks if everything was going well. Cyril instantly disagrees, but Mrs. Pearson entered into the picture and attempt to cover the situation. Tells Mrs. Fitzgerald that everything is all right and instructs Cyril not to speak. So students, यहाँ पे आपको एक चीज़ समझनी होगी. That was not even the Mrs. Pearson actually Mrs. Pearson was in fact the Mrs. Fitzgerald and Mrs. Fitzgerald was in fact Mrs. Pearson. You know previously कि उन लोगों ने body interchange कर ली थी, right? So indignantly का means in a manner of indicating anger, जब गुस्से में आप किसी को indicate करते हो, and peason का मतलब होता है referring a foolish person, right? P-I-E-C-A-N, Pison you can also say, Pican you can also say, right? So considering Mrs. Pearson is being unfair, he burst out and asked her, why shall he not speak? Mrs. Pearson shouts at Cyril and tells him to obey what she asked him to do. Mrs. Fitzgerald tried to interrupt. Mrs. Pearson instantly replies and tells Mrs. Fitzgerald to stay out of her personal and family matters. She tried to mention Cyril and is again interrupted, but this time by Cyril, and Mrs. Fitzgerald gets worried and moves to the seat. She then expresses her worries. Mrs. Pearson replies that what she has been doing was long due. She is just getting them to behave nicely. And moving closer to Mrs. Pearson, Mrs. Fitzgerald asks her if George is home. Right? Now Mrs. Fitzgerald gets worried and moves the city to sit. She then expressed her worries. Now moving to the city, whispering, "Oh dear, what's happening?" Mrs. Pearson calmly, "Nothing much, just putting them in their places. That's all. Doing what you ought to have done long since." Is Mrs. Fitzgerald, "Is George home?" Sit beside Mrs. Pearson on the settee. Mrs. Pearson, "Yes, I have been telling him what they think him at the club." Mrs. Fitzgerald, "Well, they think a lot of him, don't they?" Mrs. Pearson, "No, they don't. And now he knows it." Mrs. Fitzgerald nervously, "Oh dear, I wish you hadn't." Mrs. Fitzgerald. Mrs. Pearson, "Nonsense. Doing them all a word of good. And they all be eating out of your hands soon, you will see." Mrs. Fitzgerald, "I don't think I want them eating out of my hand." Mrs. Pearson impatiently, "Well, whatever you want, they will be doing it. All three them, mark my words." Mrs. Pearson. George enters left glumly. He is unpleasantly surprised when sees the visitor. He moves to the armchair left, sits down heavily and glums light his pipe. Then he looks from Mrs. Pearson to Mrs. Fitzgerald, who is regarding him anxiously. "George, just look it for a minute, I suppose." Mrs. Fitzgerald. Mrs. Fitzgerald, who doesn't know what she is saying. "Well, yes, I suppose so, George." George, aghast. "George." Mrs. Fitzgerald, nervously, "Oh, I am sorry." Mrs. Pearson impatiently, "What does it matter? Your name is George, isn't it? Who do you think you are? Duke or Edinburgh?" George angrily, "What is he got to do with it? Just tell me that, and isn't it bad enough without her calling me George? No tea, Pompey Pearson, and poor Doris has been crying her eyes out upstairs." Yes, crying her eyes out, right? So Mrs. Pearson replies that what she has been doing was long due. She is just getting them to behave nicely. Moving closer to Mrs. Pearson, Mrs. Fitzgerald asks if George is home. वो डरती है कि जॉर्ज घर पे हैं या नहीं. And Mrs. Pearson, जो एक्चुअल में Mrs. Fitzgerald थी, replies yes and tells her now how she had told him what they said about him at the club. Mrs. Fitzgerald, unknowing of the truth and being naturally innocent as she is, thinks that thought highly of him. Mrs. Pearson replies that Mrs. Fitzgerald thinks wrong and now George also know the truth. Mrs. Fitzgerald, being a nice person, she did not want George's feelings hurt and adds that she wished Mrs. Pearson had not done this. Mrs. Pearson tells her that she had done her good and that is the consequence would soon be visible. Everyone will start respecting and obeying her. Mrs. Fitzgerald tells Mrs. Pearson that she doesn't want to be manipulating or dominating and them to be submissive. A bit annoyed, she answered that this is happening regardless of whatever, whether she wants it to happen or not. George enters the room with a sad face. He is not happy to see Mrs. Fitzgerald. He sits on the armchair, sits on it and lights his pipe to smoke. He looks at the two women. Mrs. Fitzgerald is looking at him curiously. So glumly का मतलब होता है moody, right? George enters the scene in a not a very pleasant mood, and he also a bit shocked at the sight of Mrs. Fitzgerald in the house. So while lighting his pipe, he notices Mrs. Fitzgerald, who is awkwardly regarding him, a bit confused, and asks if she is Mrs. Fitzgerald. So Mrs. Fitzgerald, not very sure of what she should say, replies awkwardly while greeting him by his name. He gets shocked at hearing Mrs. Fitzgerald calling by his name. He gets nervous and apologizes for addressing him by his name. Right? And Mrs. Pearson instantly interferes and tells George that it's not a big deal even if she called him by his name. He is not a some duke or Edinburgh who is not supposed to be called by his name, and someone who deserves the honor. And जॉर्ज को उसके नाम से नहीं बुलाया जाना उसे बुरा लगा, लेकिन मिसेस पियर्सन कहती कि ये कोई बहुत बड़ी बात तो हुई नहीं. सो जॉर्ज लूजेज हर टेम्पर एंड पॉइंट्स आउट दैट ब्रिंगिंग द ड्यूक ऑफ एडिनबर्ग राइट between the conversation make no sense. He further adds that Mrs. Fitzgerald calling him by his name doesn't matter because the already prevailing situation is much worse. There is no tea ready. He is being called names at the club. Not forget to poor Doris who is crying endlessly. यानी पहले ही ऐसी बहुत सारी चीज़ें हो चुकी थी जिससे कि अब उसे कुछ बहुत ही आश्चर्य नहीं हो रहा था. राइट. सो स्टूडेंट्स, दिस वॉज द फिफ्थ पार्ट एंड डेफिनेटली one more day, one more part will come as soon as possible for you. That will be the final video. So dear students, you will make a revision of this again and again, and if you are getting problem, then you are free to ask inside the class group. So dear students, we will meet in another segment. Up to the time, thank you, have a nice day.